Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Amanda Lang. Coming up on the show, a look at the business of government in Canada, including is there a right size for government, and is government efficient at delivering service, plus a looming divide on pensions. That's all ahead. But first, how big is government in Canada, and is there such a thing as the right size for it? Here's a look by the numbers. Measuring government can take a few forms. On sheer employees, Canada's federal government has 335,957 of them at the end of its last fiscal year. That's an increase of more than 20% in 10 years. And new public sector jobs accounted for almost all of the job growth post-pandemic. 86.7% of jobs created between February 2020 and July 2022 were public sector jobs. Meanwhile, spending by all levels of government peaked above $1 trillion in 2020, driven by pandemic measures, before declining slightly in 2021 to $969.5 billion, a drop of 7.8%. As a percentage of GDP, that puts spending by all government in Canada at 51% of our economy. But even in 2019, it was 46% of GDP all in. What is the right size? Well, one study on optimal size of government suggests anything above 32% provides no benefit. In fact, 26% of GDP is considered the sweet spot. The benefits of government spending are steepest and most felt in education and health. When those are 20 to 25% of total government spending, there's a sharp increase in performance scores. Above that, there's little additional return. For general government spending, the number is lower, up to 10% of total spending, and it increases overall well-being. After that, overall scores actually decline. And then there's the size of government we can't see, including subsidies, tax measures, and price regulation. One estimate is that that would inflate the size of government by another 20%, making government almost two-thirds of the economy. How to measure the value of government may be complicated, and the numbers can be sliced and diced according to whatever recipe you want to follow. But what we do know is that efficiency in government is sometimes called into question. Everyone agrees that some things are done best or possibly only by the public sector, but could it do them more effectively? Michael Wernick was Canada's top civil servant as chief of the Privy Council and has written extensively about the role of government. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So there is a sense, and I want to start with this, that our public service has somehow frayed over time, that there was a kind of a golden era where deputy ministers really knew their brief and really set policy, and that we've sort of seen a decline from that. I want to start with whether you think that's true. Was there a time when we relied more heavily and appropriately on the public service?
No, there were different issues in different times. The public service that I joined was entirely dominated by white males. There was no diversity. There was workplace conduct issues that would get you fired today. It was just a different environment. The public sector, the government, is about 1/5 of the Canadian economy. It's about 1/5 of the Canadian labor force. It affects everybody else, and so I think. It's always important to pay some attention to the public sector and how it works. In Canada, we spend a lot of time talking about what government does, the laws, the regulations, the taxes, the spending programs, but you don't see a lot of sustained attention to how the public sector works.
Which, of course, is a gap because, as you note, it is one of the, not only is it a huge part of our economy and our lives, but it's one of the most important. The delivery of that services possibly the most important ones we get. What would you like to see to review it? In other words, we've heard talk of a royal commission, and there's always sort of some, hand-wringing about what could be done better. What would be the real way to take a good, broad look at what we're doing in the delivery of services and how we might improve?
Well, the public sector, federal, provincial, municipal, Indigenous, they deliver mostly services and operations and transactional services. Small part of that is the policy advice function to democratic governments. I'd like to see the public sector borrow some of the best practices from the private sector, invest heavily in training, put serious time and attention into leadership development, and pay people properly, give staff the technology and the tools to do their jobs, and invest in future-proofing. The best private sector companies spend some time thinking about the future and how they're going to have to prepare for it.
Is our public sector too big, Michael? We have seen a huge hiring spree through this pandemic. We know that it is large relative to other countries with similar goals. Is it too big right now?
That's a decision to be made in elections by political parties with different views about the role of government. My contention is whether you advocate a bigger role for government or a smaller one, whether you want the federal government to play a bigger role or a more restrained role, you should care that it works well. The politicians and the elections will sort out the size of government. Roughly speaking, the public sector in Canada right now is about exactly what it was in the mid-1980s. And future governments will make decisions to grow it or to shrink it.
Do you look at any other countries and think that could be a model for Canada, or do you think Canada is more or less the model for others?
Well, Canada is unique because it's a Westminster system and it's a federation. And almost everything of interest in Canada, from climate change to Indigenous reconciliation to trade, involves multi-government collaboration. The federal government and the provinces, municipalities, Indigenous governments have to work together to work on the problems and deliver the services that Canadians count on. So I'd like to see more collaboration across the levels of government in best practices and developing how the public sector should work in the 2020s.
Just a few seconds here, but if you were counseling Canadians, would you say we should be more or less satisfied with our government, or should we be clamoring for some changes?
I think continuous improvement is something we should always aspire to. If you look back in the tracks in the snow, we've made a lot of progress. There's not a lot of news value in things that work or slow, steady, continuous improvement. Our attention gets drawn to episodes of breakdowns and failures, and we learn from them. And the important thing is that the public sector and our politicians have learning software. You detect the errors, you correct them, and you do better next time.
So good to have you for this, Michael. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for your interest.
Michael Wernick is the former clerk of the Privy Council. Coming up, what would it take to make government function more like the private sector? And do we even want that? Stay with us.